For anybody watching this video who is my age or younger, you're going to have a hard time believing this, but I once spoke to someone who had spoken with someone, spent a lot of time with someone who had fought in the Civil War, the American Civil War back in the 1860s. Now, if you're much older than me, you know that this isn't really hard to believe because you yourself may have done the same. I'm going to tell you about the time when I actually spoke extensively with someone who had spoken and spent years with someone who fought in the Civil War. And this will make sense to you. I'm going to tell you about a decision I made sometime around the same period, and in which I was able to convince a buddy of mine to make a similar decision that about 10 or 15 years later, we realized saved our life. Saved our lives. There was two of us, more than one. Okay, so here's the deal. When I was a kid, I mean, I wasn't even a teenager yet, maybe 10 or 12 years old, I had a friend who had a grandmother who lived out in the country. And one summer, I went and spent a few days, couple nights with my friend at this grandmother's house. Now, this was back in Appalachian. It was way out in the middle of nowhere. So I'm a Gen Xer, okay, Generation X. My friend's, this was his father's parents. So his father was a baby boomer. So my friend's grandparents were of the World War II generation. They had a big property that bordered another massive property, which pretty much at one point, I mean, it was family land. They had split it at one point, but the massive property that bordered my friend's grandparents' property actually belonged to his still living great grandmother. Okay. Now, the last full day that we were there with, you know, hanging out, and we weren't really camping. We were staying inside the house, but the place, it was hundreds of acres big. So it was kind of like we were camping, except we'd go stay in the old farmhouse at night to sleep. But while we were there, my friend's grandmother said, no, make sure you go up and see great Grammy. And my friend almost had a conniption fit about this. He didn't want to go up there and see her. He said he got creeped out around her because she was so old. He said he got creeped out being in her house because it was so old. And he said he got creeped out even more by that even older house that sat way up on the hill, all grown up in briars and brambles and vines up above Great Granny's house. Well, I mean, I've always been curious and excitable, and all that stuff sounded exciting to me. And so I told my friend, we've got to go see your great grandmother. And we did. His grandmother kind of dragged us up, well, dragged him up there by his ear. I went skipping and jumping. I was excited to go up to see all these creepy places. So I remember going in this old house, and this woman, she was born in 1890. She would tell me this while we were talking to her, because at some point I said something that isn't hard to believe a 10-year-old kid would say, something like, oh my God, you're like the oldest person I've ever seen in my life. And she laughed, and she told me that she was born in 1890. That's how I knew. But she loved to work with flowers, and I couldn't even tell you the types because, again, I was 10 years old. But her entire home, like a big 2-story, maybe 3-story Victorian-type home. She lived by herself. She had been married, but her husband had been dead for a very long time. Flowers everywhere, and they were living flowers. She must have spent all day, every day, just going around working with these flowers that were in her house. They were inside the house, and most of the rooms had these large glass windows that went almost up to the ceilings, and these ginormous, like 12 feet tall drapes that she'd whip back, and the sun would come through the rooms. And she had rooms that were just, there were no furniture, just hardwood floors, but they were covered with pots with these beautiful flowers. And she would tell us what the flowers were. And again, this is going back 30, let's see, I'm 47, I would have been 10, 47 minus 10, 37 years, going back almost 40 years. So I certainly don't remember any of the names of the flowers, but I remember she told us some of them were poison. And she said she learned all this stuff about botany from her grandfather, who, by the way, and she told me that when I got older, this would mean more to me, and she was so right. Her grandfather, who, by the way, fought in the Civil War for the North, we were, well, it was West by God, Virginia, which actually split from Virginia, the motherland here in Virginia, during the Civil War, and joined the Union and became an independent state back in those days, 1864, I think, 1863, somewhere around that time. So she told me that her grandparents lived in the big old creepy house up on the hill. Her parents would end up living in the home that she now resided in, and this is back in the 1980s. This is going back so far. She said she ended up getting that house as part of her dowry. The man she married got to move in there, and that's where they raised their children. Of course, the closest lived maybe a mile and a half down the road. This was my friend's grandmother. So I remember just going through this house, and it was creepy old house. And I remember going down into the cellar, attic, or no, not attic, that's above, basement / cellar. And I remember she had a pond, or not a pond, but a well down there. And it actually had the bucket that would go down on a rope. You get your bucket of water and bring it up. Now, of course, the house had plumbing by this time. It had been put in later, but originally that's where they got their water. So while my friend's grandmother was in there in the living room talking to her, who would have been her mother-in-law, my friend's great-grandmother, my friend and I went outside for just a bit. It was growing dark, and we looked up at this even creepier looking old house up on the hill. There was a road going up to it. You could tell which at one time would have been heavily traveled, but it was all grown up now. There were trees growing in it. If you've ever seen that movie House of Wax, this is a pretty good way to explain this. That had Paris Hilton in it, and by the way, Jared Padalecki before he was in Supernatural. Many of you watching this show know of the show Supernatural, because my beautiful bride Dearly, aka Giggly Girl, and myself have talked about it on this channel, on her channel Life with Dearly. And if you've not subscribed to Life with Dearly, go do so, please. Watch her videos. We watched Supernatural last year. We started with episode 1, season 1, and went all the way through the last episode of the 15th season. 15 seasons long. It took us about 6 months to watch it. We watched it on Netflix. We just watch 1 or 2 every night for like 6 months. But Dearly developed a celebrity crush on Dean, who's played by Jensen Ackles. So I always said Sam, his brother in the show, played by Jared Padalecki, was my favorite. Well, House of Wax is one of Dearly's favorite horror movies, and we hadn't seen it in probably 8 years. So we went back and watched it here some time ago, and that's the first time it really occurred to us, look, that's Sam from Supernatural, who's really Jared Padalecki. Now, what's this have to do with the story? OMG, he's done it again. He's veered off on some other strange thing that has nothing to do with the story. Well, it does. You remember in that movie, House of Wax, if you've seen it, to get to this entire town, this entire community, you have to go through the woods. There are no roads per se, because the town had been abandoned for so long. They'd all grown up, all the roads. There were trees this big and round in the roads, and new streams had formed by new springs coming up through the soil, and just nothing had been maintained. That's what it was like looking at this big, super creepy, almost mansion of a house up on the hill above my friend's great-grandmother's house. So this would have been his great-great-great-grandparents' house. Of course, they were long gone, but the old man fought in the Civil War. Of course, the old woman spent her childhood with this man, and I spoke with her that day, talked to her quite a bit that day. So now, she was right. Now that I am older, now that I'm almost 50, now that it's 2021, it really is neat knowing that I've spoken with someone who spent time with a Civil War veteran. I mean, that's like living history. And it shows us just how not so far away we are removed from so much of history in this country. Boy, there's a whole lot of other topics right there in that, in and of itself. But that old house, I told my buddy, I said, let's go up there and check out that house. He just absolutely refused. No way did he want to go up to that old creepy house. I was like, have you ever been up there? And he goes, nope, and I'm not going to. Now I'm looking up at the sky, and, you know, I didn't wear a watch. I was a 10-year-old kid, but I knew enough. I was always outside. I was always playing outside when I was a kid. I knew enough to know that we had more than an hour of daylight left. I looked back in the window. I saw that the old woman and the old woman were in there just chatting it up. I told my friend, come on, let's go check it out. Let's just go see if we can peek in some windows. You sissy. You know, that when you're a kid, that's how you get your buddies to do what you want them to do, right? You insult them, you call them a name, call them a sissy. Well, of course they're going to do it because they got to prove to you that they're not a sissy. So we go up. It's probably a half a mile up the hill. It was a considerable walk, trying to stay in what we thought was the original road, even though there are trees growing up into it. We make it to the house, and there was this really creepy stone wall, probably 8 feet high, built around the majority of the house, except for right there in the front, but you could see steel posts from where there used to be a gate. And I remember thinking as a kid, why would you have a gate on a house this secluded, this so far out? I mean, from any main road, because my friend's grandmother and great-grandmother lived way out an old country dirt road that you wouldn't even know was there if you didn't know it was there. It was off of some old county road where, you know, those signs that say state maintenance ends here because they don't even plow past there in the winter. It was miles past this. Why would you need a gate up there? Well, anyway, there had been one at one point, but it was gone now. So we go up to the house through where the gate had been, and we get on the porch. The boards are rotted through. I remember seeing a huge black snake scurrying away from us, going up underneath the porch, and we're peering in the windows. They're dusty and dirty, and trying to rub them off with our shirts is doing no good anyway. Well, I go over to the front door, and I see that it's open. And I said, hey, come on, let's go in here and check this out. My friend's like, no, I'm not going in there. That is so creepy. And I said, come on, it's, the door's open. We still got, you know, almost an hour of daylight left. We're just going to go in the first room and look around and see what's in here. Sissy. So, you know, I call him a sissy again. So he comes in. The floors of this old house had already, they'd given way. They were non-existent. Okay, you could see some beams, some of the old original beams. Then underneath that dirt, then it was like a really fine grayish silt type dirt. This was the living room. I convinced my friend to go with me down a hall. The doors going down the hall were open. The floors were the same. You look in. The floorboards were no longer there. Only the beams, and the dirt was like that light, almost white, really dusty, fine silt. But down at the end of the hall, there was a door that was not open. It was closed. And I looked down at the foot of the door, and it wasn't flush with the ground, and there was no gap there below the door and the ground. No space, so to say, but there was solid wood. So it was as if the floor on the other side of this door that was there and that was closed was still intact. So I tried to open the door. It wouldn't open. It was locked. So I started banging on it with my shoulder. I couldn't open it. It's a 10-year-old kid. I told my friend, come on 3, let's ram this thing with our shoulders, see if we can open it up. He goes, no way. I'm not going in there. It's too creepy. I said, come on, sissy. Well, it's a magic word. I knew this by this time, right? Figured out what worked with him. Call him a sissy. So he came over beside me. 1, 2, 3. We bust the door open, okay? The door goes open. This room didn't look like any other room in the house. Okay, all the other rooms, again, the floors were gone except the beams. There was no furniture, nothing but silt, that fine silty dust. In this room, the floor was still very much intact, and it was still very much solid hardwood. There was not just furniture in the room, but beautiful furniture in the room. This stuff had to have been, I mean, we're talking about a man who was living in this house in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, probably lived up through the turn of the last century. It was that Victorian type. It was, you know, we would find out when we threw the curtains open, it was purple, it was emerald green, it looked as if it were etched in gold and silver. The windows of this room were much like the windows of the great-grandmother's house about half a mile down the hill, going all the way up to the ceiling, through the curtains back. The sun came in. Sure, there was plenty of dust covered all over everything, but it was as if this was the room where everything of value still remained. I wish I knew back then what I knew now about, and I don't know a lot about antiques or anything like that, but I do know a little bit about antique books. This room at one point obviously served as a library or a sitting room because it had a big stone fireplace, stone hearth, beautiful wooden mantle above it. And then on the back wall from that, it was nothing but bookshelves. And the bookshelves were packed with what appeared to be leather-bound hardback books. Now, let me tell you, here, I'm going to veer off for just a second to tell you a story about an old book, and that you'll see why it's relevant to this story. I can't imagine what these books were worth. I remember back around 2005 or so, this is the time when so many of the World War II generation were really dying of old age in illnesses in mass. I think it was something like we were losing 10,000 World War II generation people a day. I remember hearing the numbers, the statistics. And here in Central Virginia, a lot of the baby boomers were inheriting their parents' houses. And a lot of these boomers weren't living here anymore. They'd gone off to school. They moved to Chicago. They moved to New York. They moved out west. They went somewhere. They were coming home, getting the houses they inherited, cleaning them out and selling them. Because basically, and not out of any sort of disrespect. It's just, you know, Junior's life was now out in Chicago. He was a lawyer in Chicago. This house out here, in Central Virginia was of no use to him. So you could find some really neat old stuff at yard sales during those days for really, really like next to nothing. Well, you remember eBay. It's still there. A lot of people call it Feebay because their fees have gotten so high. I used to be a power seller on eBay. I used to make between $3,000 and $4,000 a month selling stuff on eBay. Not a lot of money in the grand scheme of things, but you know what? Enough to live off of and enough to not have to have a real job and have a boss. Listen, if this is something that you're like, man, I'd be interested in doing that. How did you do that? Here's how I'd get my stuff, okay, to sell on eBay. Yard sales. And it helps if you live in an affluent area like, you know, Charlottesville. There's all these rich people around here. When they have yard sales, they're just trying to get rid of stuff. They're not trying to make money. So think if there's any affluent areas or larger populated areas around you, that's the type of place to go yard selling. But you don't go early in the morning, you know, when they start at 8 a.m. You don't show up with everybody else trying to race to get the good stuff. Okay, most yard sales end at noon. That's when you show up. You show up at noon and you show up with a $20 bill. I'm going to tell you what I did every Saturday, and I would get truckloads worth of stuff from these yard sales for $20 a truckload. Thought I heard our friend screaming from the forest. Keep listening and keep getting my six. So I'd show up, you know, and the people there, okay, even though they're just trying to get rid of stuff, they're kind of content that they have made some money. You know, they made several hundreds of dollars or whatever, maybe more, depending on what they had and how much stuff they had. So, you know, I'd look around, I'd pick stuff up, I'd look at it like I'm, you know, not even interested, and I'd put it down. I'd say, wow, looks like you already sold all the good stuff, huh? And the people are like, yeah. And they're just kind of wishing I'd hurry up and leave and get out of there so they could just be done, right? I'm like, man, I always miss the good stuff. I always sleep in on Saturdays. And they're like, yeah, we had a lot of good stuff. It sold. Then I'd tell them, say, I'll tell you what, looks like you got nothing left, and now you got to box all this stuff back up and put it in the attic or whatever, or just restore it. I'd reach into my pocket, I'd pull out my wallet, I'd open it up, and I'd pull out that crisp, brand new $20 bill, and I'd say, look, I'll give you 20 bucks for all this, everything you got left. I'll box it up, I'll throw it in my truck. If I can use any of it, which I doubt I can, I will. If not, I'll give the rest to Goodwill, or maybe I'll make a buck or two off of it. But here, which would you rather have? A crisp, brand new $20 bill, or the responsibility of packing all this stuff back up and putting it back in storage? Then I'd shut up. You don't say anything. Just shut up. They look at it. It's not that they need the money. Again, I explained the demographics around here. They're like, sure, man. They'd swipe that $20 bill from my hand. They'd say, take it. And I would get an entire truckload of stuff for 20 bucks. Now, I'd take it home. If there's anything I wanted in it, which sometimes there was, I'd keep it. If there was anything of value that I felt I could make a buck or two or 20 or 50 off of on eBay, I'd list it for sale. Or, you know, you can sell on Amazon too as well. And if I didn't want it and I didn't think there was enough of a profit margin after messing around with shipping it out and all that stuff, I would take that to Goodwill and I would donate this stuff. About once a month, I'd donate a truckload, and then I'd get the receipt to take the tax deduction. Well, I don't have to worry about that now because the standard deduction, which we take, is up to like $24,500 or something. You don't even need to worry about mortgage interest now. For the first time in American history, it's no longer beneficial to have a mortgage just so you can deduct the interest from your taxes. Because whatever, I don't want this to be a financial planning session. But that's what I do, okay? Now, what's this have to do with this creepy old house and all those books I saw in that old room from the Civil War veterans house? Well, I went to a yard sale one weekend. It did my $20 bill trick, and I guess the World War II generation guy that had lived there had been an avid reader. He had a lot of books. So I took these books home, and I started looking them up on the internet because I was like, what is this? And I remember one of those books was a book called The American Wild Turkey. It was a first edition hardback copy from 1949. I put a search in there to find out if this book was worth anything. That book was worth $400 on the low side and $600 on the top side. People collect books. If you have a rare book, hardback, in good condition, there's a market for those sorts of things. So I'm listing these things. I sold that book on eBay for like $395. There were dozens of books that I got that day in my truckload of stuff for a crisp new $20 bill that sold for between $50 and $100. I made somewhere around $1,000 off of books from that yard sale haul on eBay over the course of the next week from a $20 investment. So the point of that story is, when I was a 10-year-old little kid watching the sun rays shine on an entire back wall of a huge house and of a huge room in an old creepy house with leather-bound books from the 1800s, if not the 1700s, I can't imagine what that would be worth. So anyway, I hear my friend say, hey, look at this. And I hear like a top pop. I turn around, and in front of between the fireplace and all these books, which I would later find out, well, I don't want to get ahead of myself, there was a table. My friend had found what appeared to be a bottle of wine, okay? And he said, let's try this. Let's drink this. We're 10-year-old kids. Never had alcohol before in my life. And I was like, no, we don't want to do that. That's nasty. And he's smelling it. He goes, smell it. He holds it up to my nose. I remember it smelled like death. Best way I could describe it. And I was like, I'm not drinking anything that smells like that. And I put it on the table. And where I put it on the table, there was like a piece of paper, thicker than common stationery, almost as thick as cardboard. I guess heavy stock paper. And there were words written on it in calligraphy by one of those feather pens. I remember moving the dust away. I'm getting creeped out remembering this. And the card, it was a card about this size. It said, to the victors go the spoils. To the victors go the spoils is what it said. And the only thing on that table was that card and this bottle of what we thought was wine with the cap on it. I talked my friend out of drinking this. I'm like, look, no, let's just, that might make us sick. He smells it again. He goes, yeah, you're right. You know, the kid in him wanted to, you know, see what it was like sneaking a drink of wine. But after he smelled how bad it smelled, he's like, no way am I drinking that. It'll make us sick. So we put it on there, put the cap back in. I'm looking up, taking everything in around the room. And I noticed, too, the man had been a taxidermist. There are foxes, pheasants, rabbits, all over the place, turkeys in this room. This was like, you talk about a man room, this was it. Okay, so we look out the window, we notice it's getting dark. My friend is freaking out. He's like, come on, this is creepy, we're going to end up seeing a ghost. And I said, okay, let's leave. So we got out of the room, we shut the door back to the best of our ability. We went back down the trail, and my friend's grandmother was on the front porch, just started to yell for us. Said that her mother-in-law needed to go to bed because she went to bed when the sun went down and she woke up when it came up. And so we went back in, said goodbye to the old woman. It was the last time I ever spoke to somebody who had actually spent time speaking and being around someone who had actually fought in the Civil War. That still to this day, 2021, amazes me. So on the way back home, we're asking all kinds of questions about the old man that lived up in the creepy old almost mansion-sized home, the Civil War veteran, who would have been my friend's grandmother's great father-in-law, I guess. She knew him a little bit when she was a little girl before he died. She said he was creepy. He was, he always made her nervous, and he was very mean to animals. Like, she told us a story that he was into taxidermy, but he didn't hunt and kill the animals that he would mount or stuff with a firearm. He poisoned them. He would poison them on his property. And he said he liked to do that because he could then have their entire body unharmed. It didn't have any bullet holes in any of the fur, any of the hides. So it looked even more realistic when he mounted them or stuffed them or whatever taxidermists do. And I'm looking over that way because I'm seeing a bee. I'm making sure it's not a wasp. It's not. It's one of our honeybees. We just installed 8,000 honeybees. Go back and watch that video. Nobody did. Everybody's like, does this guy ever even make homesteading videos? WTF. Yeah, we do. And when we do, 2,000 people watch. But when I tell creepy stories, 20,000 people watch. Gee, what would you do, brah? So anyway, turns out the guy was creepy, kind of morbid, but he had a lot of money. Of course, it was passed down through the family. He never buried treasure anywhere. But again, obviously, somebody about 15 years or so later knew those books were there. Or it might have been someone who was just prowling around, thieving, saw the books, and decided they'd take themselves an armful of them because they found a man on that property dead about 15 years after that. No, it wouldn't have even been that long because we were in college. Okay, so if I was 10, I was probably 21, 11 years later. Found a man dead, some degenerate. Now, of course, the old woman was dead. My friend's grandparents were dead, but somebody was living in the house. But some degenerate had made their way up to the Civil War veterans' house, gotten into that room, obviously knew what they were looking at, whereas I, as a 10-year-old kid, didn't. Took a couple of armloads of books, made it down the hill almost half a mile to that other house. And they were doing this under the cover of darkness because the next day they were found dead. They had parked their car a couple of miles down the road in a wide spot, deciding to go up into this house in the dead of night and see what they could steal. The autopsy that was performed came back. It determined that the degenerate had died by way of poisoning. He drank strychnine. Strychnine, the old Civil War veteran used to poison the animals that he would mount. Strychnine, which he had kept in that bottle on that small table in between the fireplace and those books, which are worth a small fortune. And this degenerate who decided to take a couple armfuls of those books and make his way off with them and maybe sell them on eBay, which didn't exist at the time, but sell them somewhere. Well, he sure was the victor. And I guess he couldn't resist that bottle of wine right there, and he took him a drink before he left. and he certainly got the spoils. See you for more next time.